All right, hello everyone. My name is David McTaggart, and welcome to the first of two lectures on extending the grazing season with various different winter grazing strategies. All right, so in the first part of this two-part series, we'll be looking at the main principles of extending the grazing season and what factors we need to be considering as livestock managers. And then in the next lecture that I'll be preparing, we'll look at a real life application of grazing and looking at what those factors that we learned today look like once put into practice in real life. Before we start, I'll just provide a little bit of background information on myself. I grew up on a small hobby farm near Lacombe, Alberta, and was a member of the 4-H youth program for 9 years, participating in both the beef and the gardening projects. Now, I developed my interest in agriculture, food, and land stewardship through 4-H, in addition to helping out on my extended family's farm near Camrose, Alberta, and working at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lacombe. I came to the University of Saskatchewan in 2016 for my degree in crop science, which I completed this past year, after which I started my field research with Dr. Billigatu. And I am researching the accuracy of drone imaging as a tool to identify better breeding populations of Sicer milkvetch and meadow brome grass for stockpile grazing. Now, since stockpile grazing is one of the many options to extend that grazing season, that is why I was asked to give this presentation here today. All right, so we have three key questions that will help guide our exploration of extended grazing here today. The first one is, what is extended grazing? Well, extended grazing is many things, and I'll just be exploring a few parts of what I know to be true about the practice. Second, why should you use extended grazing on your farm? What are some of the pros? And like all practices, there's pros and cons. And here, those cons are considerations. The third question, what factors must be considered before taking on extended grazing? Now, like I hinted at in the previous slide, extended grazing is a very broad concept that takes many different forms in real life. Now, my definition for extended the grazing season goes something like this. Extended grazing is any feeding strategy that delays livestock from going into a confined dry lot or yard feeding system until after the growing season is complete. Again, extended grazing is any feeding strategy that delays livestock from going into a confined dry lot feeding system until after the growing season is complete. Now, it always amazes me all the different forms that extended grazing can take. Now, the use of extended grazing techniques has been increasing across Western Canada in recent years. And one of the factors influencing this is the fact that winter feed accounts for over 60% of the total production costs for some cow-calf producers in Western Canada. And so finding ways to lower that cost is always helpful. Now, according to the Western Canadian Cow-Calf Survey, in recent years, the use of extended grazing practices has increased across Western Canada, demonstrated here that between 2014 and 2017, the use of swath grazing, bale grazing, stockpile grazing, grazing standing corn, and stubble grazing has all increased. And this is in comparison to a survey that was done in Manitoba in 1999, which is about the oldest one I could find, that demonstrated at this time only 2% of the producers surveyed were using stockpiled perennial forage as a winter feeding strategy. And this in comparison to 2017, when approximately 40% of producers were using stockpiled perennial forage. Now, between 2014 and 2017, the use of bale processors and rolled forage decreased quite substantially. Now, in looking at these results, it's always important to keep in mind the winter conditions, because that influences the winter feeding strategies producers will use. Now, in my memory, I remember 2017 and 2016, that winter time, being fairly snow-free, and the early 2010s, at least in Alberta, had quite a bit of snow. So that's always important to keep in mind there. All right, so now that we know what extended grazing is, let's shift to our second key question, which is why use extended grazing on your farm and ranch? And we'll explore three main reasons to do so today, here together. And they are: first, economics; second, soil health; and third, crop rotation options. All right, so here's a cost table breaking down some of the main categories that play into the cost of a winter feeding system. Now, what you see here, there's more of a range in that swath grazing category, and that's because it accounts for several different species I saw in some papers I was looking at, which includes oats, triticale, and barley. And those were from studies conducted by Vern Barron from Ag Canada in Lacombe, Alberta. So extended grazing typically offers savings in relation to a traditional hay-based winter diet fed in confined pens for several reasons. The first of those, as you're seeing, being fertilizer. Haying pulls a great deal of nutrient off of the land because you're harvesting both the vegetation and the seeds. And if you ever take a class by Jeff Shano, he'll describe the nutrient demands of a hay stand. And it is quite costly, as you're seeing in this breakdown here. Another one is labor. From all that time spent seeding, cutting, raking, baling, and feeding out of a haying operation. And this also plays into the machine costs that you have to own and operate, or operate sometimes. Sometimes people don't own their equipment. That is needed for that haying, seeding, and feeding as well. And then as we shift into comparing that total cost versus the per cow day per hectare cost, the difference between these different options decreases. And that's most often because of carrying capacity. And that ranges, so for a hay stand in these studies, a hay stand had about 540 cow days per hectare carrying capacity. Swath grazing varied quite significantly. So barley had a lower stocking or carrying capacity around 500 cow days per hectare. And then for triticale, that ranged upwards to about 1,000. Then corn also has quite a high carrying capacity, but stockpiled perennial forages, they are very low cost. However, that also does come with a lower carrying capacity. That's, for these studies, were around 200 cow days per hectare. And so that's all of a sudden why you see swath grazing and stockpiled perennial forages being a lot similar in cost. So like extended grazing itself, soil health is a very wide topic, and so I will be just focusing on how extended grazing impacts the subsection of soil health that is fertility benefits. And like was mentioned in the previous slide, the fertilizer requirements of a hay stand versus grazing land vary quite a bit. And that's because cattle excrete 70 to 90% of the nutrients that they take in through their manure and urine. And this allows a lot of those nutrients that were in the forage to be recaptured and put back into the soil. However, it's important to consider that especially with manure nutrients from cattle, those nutrients are released quite slowly, particularly with nitrogen, where only 10 to 15% of that organic N is released every year from processes like decomposition and mineralization put together. And so what this means, especially for a system like swath grazing where you're planting a crop every year, is that some synthetic fertilizer will most likely be required to fill that gap between what the soil and the manure can supply in comparison to what the crop needs. And so synthetic fertilizers will most likely fill this space. But as always, it's important to soil test and see what the nutrient delivering capacity of your soil is in relation to what crop you're growing. So on their own, cattle don't usually poop and pee in a nice uniform pattern across the field, which is a bit of a bummer because nutrients from manure and urine are typically concentrated around bedding packs and water supplies. And this has potential negative impacts on water quality, particularly if your pastures are situated on a slope or close, to nearby water bodies, because during spring runoff, nutrients can be carried off from the manure and then cause water quality issues. Now, this can be managed by using a temporary fence, which can also improve your forage utilization as well, so allowing you to pull more off that land and improve your grazing days. Now, there is emerging research that is starting to show the benefits of particularly extended grazing using stockpiled perennials to increase soil organic carbon levels, which is beneficial for not only carbon sequestration, but things like water holding capacity and nutrient storage as well. But it's important to consider that monitoring changes in soil organic carbon due to cropping systems is quite complicated, and researchers are just starting to know how to measure that effectively. So to understand the rotation benefits of extended grazing, I'm going to mostly focus on annual crops here. Now, farming has several parts of the year that are very crunched for time, and one of those is seeding in the spring. Now, swath grazing allows for a later seeding time in the late spring, early summer, when schedules may be less busy. For example, corn's typically seeded in that late May, early June time here on the prairies, and swath grazed annuals like oats, barley, and triticale can be seeded even later in June. Now, in some areas, winter annuals like fall rye and winter wheat can also be grazing options, and they can be seeded in the late summer and early fall, where they can be available for grazing first thing in the spring the next year before perennial pastures have started to grow. They also offer a weed management benefit because they were already established in that springtime and can help outcompete those early season weeds like wild oats to help provide herbicide savings on farms. Now, grazing corn also offers the attribute of the potential to use broad spectrum herbicides like glyphosate if that's a part of a farm's weed management plan. There's also the option of using polycultures. And this is when multiple different groups of species like legumes, cereals, forbs, and brassicas are seeded together that all access different areas of the soil profile. And that can help maximize your nutrient recovery, in addition to providing many different sources of nutrition for the cattle as well, from more of that perspective. Now, short-term perennial forages are also an option. Now, while they are not always very common, because they sometimes require an establishment year and can have very high seed costs, there are a lot of benefits to those. And one of them is the fact that they can mobilize nutrients from the subsoil based on just the sheer depth of their rooting system, like you're seeing here with alfalfa. And studies from the U of S have shown that they can help mobilize phosphorus from the subsoil that annual crops would never be able to have accessed by themselves, and move it up into a space where the annuals can get them after that perennial stand has been terminated. In addition to, once you have that stand established, it's quite low cost to maintain. And my hope is that as we develop our climate mitigation strategy in Canada more, we might be able to hopefully, I'm hopeful here, that the benefits of perennials in sequestering carbon can be recognized, and farmers could use carbon credits as a potential source of alternate income on their farms. Now, moving into our third key question, what are those factors to consider when making a winter grazing plan? And these are by no means an all-encompassing list of factors, but is meant to get the ball rolling and to think about, okay, what do I all need to consider before I take on winter grazing for my farm or ranch? And I found that there were kind of four main categories in this area, which are your livestock, your grazing site, the forage itself, and the environment. And this can be broken down into several subsections as well. Now, just to explain a few more of these, down in livestock with the aspect of production goals, this can mean many things, including what class of livestock are we grazing and what do we want to achieve with those livestock. So for example, with dry cows that are pregnant, you might have the production goal to maintain their body weight throughout the winter. However, if you have backgrounding calves, we might be targeting a certain weight gain every day. So that's an example of what production goals means. Under the category of site, topography describes, okay, what am I dealing with a hilly landscape that might be better suited to perennials to avoid soil erosion every year? Are we in a low-lying area that might be better suited to swath grazing in the early winter once the land has frozen up? Are we close to a water body? This might not even be the best place for winter grazing then, because as I mentioned in the previous slide, during spring runoff, there might be concerns with manure running off into your water and causing quality issues. Under the land-based category, do you have enough pasture with your land base and the number of cattle that you have to leave some of those perennial forages to stockpile until the winter? Ease of access, when you need to supplement for feed in the winter time, how easy is it for you to get in there, for example, with a tractor and a bale processor, if that's what your system is? Or if there's severe weather coming, how easy is it to round up those livestock, whether you're driving them back to the farm or whether you're loading them up into a trailer to get back and hustle and get home? So from here, the arguments that are circled will be discussed briefly in the future slides as well. Now, there's a lot of things to consider there, but you don't need to worry. The sky isn't falling. Yes, there's a lot to consider when putting in together your winter grazing plan. However, this just allows your operation to be prepared for when surprises come once you're putting that plan into place, and you'll be ready to deal with those surprises, and while maintaining the health of your livestock and your land and maintaining your bottom line as well. All right, so the three components of the livestock idea of the considerations that we'll look at a bit more is quantity of livestock, the type of livestock you have, and the stage of gestation when we're looking at pregnant cows. Some of this might be a little bit of a repeat from earlier in the presentation, but hopefully this helps to clarify certain concepts. So first off, quantity. This is in regards to your stocking density and the size of your grazing herd. And this influences mostly the utilization that you get from your forage. For example, when grazing standing corn in the winter, you typically want to graze sections of the field that you fence off with temporary fencing. And this way, this forces the cattle to eat the entire corn plant, not just the cobs. And what this helps to do is it helps to extend the grazing time that you can get on that field, in addition to preventing acidosis from the high content, the high starch content in the forage. Then next is the type of livestock. So this refers to the cattle class that you'll be grazing, and that influences, like I've said before, the nutritional requirements of your cattle. And for example, dry pregnant cows on the top right here we'll be looking at maintaining their body condition, and so their TDN requirements and crude protein requirements are lower than something in compared to backgrounding calves. And I know these are most likely bred heifers on the bottom left, but let's pretend that they're backgrounding calves, where we're looking at growing these animals, adding weight, and so they have higher nutritional requirements. And then last, rounding things off, is the stage of gestation. And everybody loves a little cow or a little baby calf picture. This is my mom, by the way, in the picture. And a cow's nutritional requirements increase as gestation progresses. And so typically, gestating cows are best fed on winter grazing during the first and second trimesters. Winter in Saskatchewan offers many lovely things. But with that cold that comes along with it, the energy needs of your cattle or your livestock increase with that. And so, as an action to counteract the cold, it is our job as livestock managers to make sure that they receive adequate shelter through a combination of barns, windbreaks, trees, bush, lean-tos, and straw packs. And that is both good for you and good for your livestock. And why? Cattle will be warm and healthy. And in addition to that, by keeping them warmer, their feed requirements won't quite be as high. And so that is also good for the bottom line. The need for good shelter is something that Dr. Bart Lardner, who historically gives this lecture, I remember him always stressing that providing good shelter during the winter is one of our most important jobs as livestock managers. Now, all of these plans are very important. However, be ready for your winter grazing plan to change over time, because with changes in temperature, wind precipitation, forage quality, and your cattle's energy needs, you'll need to adapt your winter feeding plan, along with that. So it's always important to expect the unexpected. Rounding off this presentation, we're going to look briefly at some environmental factors that influence extended grazing. And so, first off, looking at growing season precipitation, in addition to changes in the forage species that you see typically between the different soil zones, the amount of precipitation that you have will influence the quantity of forage that accumulates. And this will be different in areas like the brown soil zone that you're seeing in the picture on the left versus the aspen parkland that you're seeing on the picture on the right. And so the impact of this is the land base that you'll need to maintain your herd changes depending on how much forage there is on that land, in addition to how often you'll need to move your livestock and the amount of supplemental feed that will be necessary. Now, snow also greatly impacts the ability for livestock to graze during the late fall and winter time as well. So cattle in particular is where we'll focus. They can easily paw through light and fluffy snow, and this is also a good source of water in the wintertime. Now, once things like Chinooks come through in the wintertime, and being from Alberta, we get Chinooks quite often when the warm weather comes over the Rocky Mountains. This can come through and melt the snow with a period of positive temperatures. And first off, this actually takes away your water supply, which is a concern. But then if you get hard, crusty snow, like that then will make it more difficult for the livestock to get underneath and access that forage. So these are some of the factors that will change your grazing plan as you go through the late fall and into the winter. So this just is a summary of the sources that I used to develop my presentation. And thank you very much all for listening in. It was a pleasure to get the chance to provide a presentation for your class. Take care and stay well, everybody.